I still remember that day like it's etched into my mind. I walked into my house after a long day at work, expecting the usual calm, the soft hum of home. But the moment I opened the door, everything changed. Dear listeners, before we begin this story, I want to ask you a favor. If my story resonates with your heart, please like this video and subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or state you are listening from. It warms my spirit to know how far my voice travels. Happy listening, the first thing I noticed was the noise. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the usual laughter or quiet chatter, it was shouting. My husband's voice, sharp and full of anger, filled the living room, and then I saw her, my mom, standing there looking small like she had been caught in a storm. I froze, my hands gripped the doorframe. I didn't know if I should step in or just run away. I've never heard him yell like that, not ever. My stomach twisted, my chest felt tight. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I just stood there, unable to move as the words flew between them. "Why can't you understand?" he shouted. "I'm only trying to help," my mom replied, her voice trembling. And then there was silence, but only for a moment before his voice rose again. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to run to her, to hug her, to tell her it would be okay, but something held me back. Part of me was too shocked to move. I had no idea how long I stood there, maybe a minute, maybe 5. Time felt heavy, like it had slowed down just to watch me. I could feel tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, but I swallowed them down. I didn't want to show weakness. Not yet, and then something happened. I don't know if it was the look on my mom's face or the sudden quiet that fell, but I noticed a change in him. The anger, the sharpness seemed to fade just slightly, like smoke drifting away. He looked at her, really looked, not like before. And I realized for the first time that day that maybe this fight wasn't the end of the world. Maybe there was a chance for something else to happen, but I didn't know that yet. I just stood there, frozen, trying to breathe, trying to understand. My mind was a jumble of thoughts. Why is he so angry? Did I do something wrong? How can this be happening in my own home? And in that moment, I made a choice. I didn't step in. I didn't speak. I just watched, hoping, maybe praying, that somehow in a few minutes things would change. To understand that moment, you have to know a little about our lives. My mom has always been a quiet, caring woman. She isn't loud or confrontational. She believes in helping people, even when it's not asked for. She came to live with us about a year ago after her husband passed away. I thought it would be good for her, for all of us. I never imagined it would lead to moments like that day. My husband. He's not an angry man, not normally. He's calm, patient, the type of person who thinks things through before he speaks. We've had arguments, of course, like any couple, but nothing like this. So when I heard him yelling at my mom, I couldn't reconcile the man I know with the one in front of me. I had come home early that day because I had a meeting canceled. I thought it would be nice to surprise them, maybe make some tea, hear about their day. I never imagined walking in would feel like stepping into a storm. I peeked into the living room before fully entering, and that's when I saw it, the tension, thick in the air, pressing down on everything. My mom was holding a small basket of groceries, her hands shaking slightly. He was pacing, his face red, his hands gesturing wildly. The words they exchanged seemed heavy, full of frustration, but also sadness. I remember thinking, this isn't just an argument, there's something deeper here. I remembered the earlier days when my mom first moved in. There were small disagreements, tiny sparks that I brushed off as trivial. Who knew that over time, these tiny sparks could build into something that would explode so suddenly? I took a deep breath and stepped into the room. Both of them looked up at me. My mom's eyes were wide, almost pleading. My husband's expression softened slightly, but the anger was still there, lurking beneath the surface. "I didn't know you'd be here," I said softly, trying to sound casual, though my heart was racing. "It's nothing," my mom murmured, her voice small. "It's fine," my husband said, but I could hear the tension still in his words. And then something surprising happened. My husband's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. He ran a hand over his face, as if trying to shake off the anger that had taken over him just moments before. My mom's hands tightened on the basket, and I realized we were all holding our breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wanted to step forward to fix things, to say something comforting, but I paused. I realized sometimes words don't help. Sometimes just being there silently can change everything. It was in that moment, standing between them, that I began to see something I hadn't before. I saw the strain of living together, of trying to balance love, respect, and boundaries. I saw my husband struggling to understand my mom's intentions, and my mom struggling to feel welcomed in a home that was hers too, in a way. And as I watched them, I knew that whatever happened next, it could go either way. That day could end in more shouting, in tears, in anger, or it could be the day everything changed. After that long pause, I finally decided to sit down on the couch. I motioned to my mom to take a seat too. She hesitated, looking between me and my husband, but eventually she sat down, her hands folded neatly in her lap, still clutching the basket of groceries like a shield. My husband didn't sit. He remained standing, but his pacing slowed. I could see the tension in his shoulders starting to ease, as if my quiet presence somehow reminded him that this wasn't a battle to win, but a family to protect. I took a deep breath. "Let's just talk," I said softly, almost a whisper. "Please, no yelling." He glanced at me, then at my mom. For a moment, I thought he might argue, but then he nodded slowly. I could see him struggling to gather his thoughts, trying to figure out where to begin. My mom's voice was small, almost breaking. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I just thought I could help." "I know," he said, finally sitting down on the edge of the sofa, keeping a careful distance from her. I felt like my space was being invaded, like nothing I said mattered. It was a shocking thing to hear. I had always known him to be patient, but this vulnerability was new. It made me realize that maybe beneath the anger there was fear too. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing control, fear of losing the home he had built for us. I didn't speak for a few seconds, letting the silence linger. Sometimes silence is louder than words. I could feel my mom relaxing slightly, her hands loosening on the basket. I could feel him relaxing too, his gaze softening, no longer sharp and cutting. I wanted to step in, to say something that would heal the tension completely. But I also knew this wasn't about me. It was about them, about understanding, about letting each other be heard. I think we just need to understand each other," I said finally. "We all want the same thing, we just go about it differently." He nodded again, my mom's eyes glistened. "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered. "You're not," I said gently. "We love you, we need you." He looked at her, really looked, and I could see something shift. His anger, that raw, explosive force from moments ago, seemed to fade into something gentler, calmer. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. I didn't mean to yell," he admitted quietly. I felt my chest loosen. Finally, the storm had started to pass. We sat there in silence for a while, just breathing, letting the tension drain out of the room. I could feel a warmth returning, little by little, like sunlight breaking through dark clouds. It was a quiet, subtle change, but it was real. And then he spoke again. I think I overreacted." My mom nodded, a small, hopeful smile forming on her lips. "I didn't mean to push," she said softly. "I know," he replied, "and I appreciate you trying to help. I wasn't ready." I could feel tears threatening to spill, but I held them back. Instead, I just sat there, grateful for this fragile moment of reconciliation. It wasn't perfect, nothing like that ever is, but it was a start. We began to talk more slowly after that, sharing our feelings, our frustrations, and our hopes. And even though the room was quiet, it was full of something stronger than anger, understanding. After that first conversation, I noticed a shift in our household. It wasn't dramatic, not immediately, but small gestures began to replace the tension. My husband would ask my mom if she wanted tea or check if she needed help carrying something heavy. My mom, in turn, started to respect his space more, giving him time to adjust to her presence. It was strange to watch at first. I had never seen them interact like this, cautiously, respectfully, but with genuine effort. The shouting had disappeared, replaced by conversations filled with pauses, careful words, and occasional laughter. I realized then that anger often masks something deeper: fear, insecurity, or simply a lack of understanding. Once you uncover that, healing begins. One evening, a week after that confrontation, I watched them cook together. My husband, usually so precise and serious in the kitchen, was trying to teach my mom how to make a dish he loved. My mom, hesitant at first, finally laughed when she dropped an ingredient on the floor. "You missed a spot," he said, trying to sound stern, but his eyes twinkled. "I did not," she replied, giggling, a laugh so soft and genuine that I hadn't heard in years. I stood in the doorway watching them. My heart felt full. It was like watching ice slowly melt. The room had changed. The energy was no longer tense. It was warm, familiar, safe. I realized then that these moments mattered more than any argument. It wasn't about who was right or wrong. It wasn't about control. It was about connection, about choosing love, patience, and understanding, even when it's hard. Over the next few days, I noticed more small changes. My husband would ask my mom about her day without impatience. My mom started leaving little notes around the house, small gestures of love, and I started to feel something I hadn't felt in months: peace. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were still moments of tension, moments where old habits tried to creep back in. But now, instead of exploding, we learned to pause, to breathe, and to talk things through. One night, I sat on the couch watching them laugh over a shared memory. My husband turned to my mom and said, "I'm glad you're here." And my mom smiled, a soft, tender smile. "I'm glad too." I realized then that sometimes change happens in the smallest moments, a shared smile. A pause instead of a shout, a gentle word instead of an accusation. It wasn't easy, nothing meaningful ever is, but it was real, it was heartfelt, and it was enough. That day when I walked in and froze, it felt like the end of something terrible. But in reality, it was the beginning of something new, a new understanding, a new patience, a new way of being together as a family. I learned that yelling doesn't solve anything. Anger alone never changes hearts. But listening, truly listening, and allowing space for feelings, even the difficult ones, can change everything. And as I sat there watching them, I knew that this experience, painful as it was, had brought us closer. It had shown us what mattered: respect, love, and the willingness to try again, even after mistakes. The days following that incident felt surreal. Every time I thought about what had happened, a knot formed in my stomach. I kept replaying the moment I walked in and froze, watching my husband yell at my mom. I wondered if I should have said something sooner, if I should have stepped in, if maybe I was too passive. But at the same time, I understood that stepping in at the wrong moment could have made things worse. Sometimes, just letting people breathe, even in anger, allows space for change. I tried to give them time: time to speak, time to calm down, and time to understand each other. I noticed small gestures, small changes that told me we were moving in the right direction. My mom started cleaning less aggressively around the house, and my husband seemed to notice without commenting. He began to soften in his tone when talking to her. It was subtle, but I could see it. One afternoon, I found myself sitting quietly in the kitchen while my mom washed dishes and my husband was reading a book. The silence was comforting, not tense. My mom looked at me and said softly, "I hope he forgives me for earlier." I smiled gently. "He doesn't need to forgive you. He just needed to understand you, and I think he's starting to." She nodded but didn't say anything more. I could tell she was still worried, still unsure if she truly belonged in our home. I went over and touched her shoulder lightly. "We love having you here, Mom. You're not a burden. Never forget that." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. For a moment, I felt the weight of all our struggles, all the misunderstandings, all the silent worries we had carried lift slightly. Later that week, there was a small argument again, nothing like before, just a tense moment about chores. But this time, instead of raising his voice, my husband simply asked, "Can we talk about this calmly?" My mom nodded, and they sat together at the dining table. I watched from the doorway, quietly smiling, noticing that the storm had lost its strength. It was no longer explosive, it was a gentle drizzle. I began to notice how much we had all grown in just a short time. My mom learned to step back and let us handle certain things on our own, while my husband learned to accept help without feeling like his authority was being challenged. The key, I realized, was patience: patience with each other and patience with ourselves. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, my husband surprised us. He had made a small dessert, something he used to make when we first got married. My mom's eyes lit up and she whispered, "You remembered." "I remembered a lot of things," he said softly, a small smile tugging at his lips. We all sat there together, eating, talking quietly. The laughter was tentative at first, but soon it became genuine. And in that moment, I realized how fragile happiness could be, but also how resilient. One bad moment doesn't have to define everything. I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for their willingness to change, for their efforts to understand each other, for the quiet moments where love quietly seeped back in between the cracks of our broken patience. It was a lesson I hadn't expected to learn that day when I walked in and froze. I also realized how important it was to allow people to express their emotions, even if they are unpleasant. Yelling, frustration, misunderstanding, they all exist in families. But if we can step back, breathe, and give space, those moments can become turning points instead of disasters. That night, I went to bed feeling a little lighter. The tension that had gripped our home for months had loosened just a little, and though I didn't know how long it would last, I felt hopeful. Hopeful that this was the beginning of something better. The following days were a mix of quiet understanding and cautious conversations. I noticed how my husband would pause before speaking, thinking about how his words might affect my mom. And my mom, in turn, was careful with her actions, always making sure she wasn't overstepping. It was a delicate balance, but it was working. Slowly, our home began to feel like home again, not just a place, but a space where hearts could breathe. One afternoon, I decided to join them in the living room. My mom was folding laundry while my husband was fixing a small lamp. They barely noticed me at first, absorbed in their tasks, but there was a calmness I hadn't seen before. I sat down quietly and watched them. There was no yelling, no tension, just two people trying to coexist, learning each other's rhythms. "Do you remember how we used to fight over this lamp when we first moved in?" my husband asked, half smiling. My mom chuckled softly. "Yes, and you always insisted on doing everything your way." "I guess I've learned that sometimes your way isn't the only way," he admitted. The laughter that followed was small but genuine. It felt like sunlight sneaking into a room after a long storm. I realized then that healing doesn't always come from grand gestures or dramatic apologies. Sometimes it comes from small moments like this, moments of shared understanding, moments where pride is set aside and hearts are open enough to forgive and adapt. Over the next few days, our routines began to change subtly. Dinner conversations became longer, not about chores or responsibilities, but about memories, small joys, and even silly stories from the past. My mom started sharing things she hadn't shared in years, recipes, childhood tales, her thoughts about life. And my husband, who had always been reserved, began to listen more attentively, sometimes even contributing with stories of his own. One evening, I watched them sitting side by side on the couch, quietly talking. I realized that what had seemed like an impossible situation, anger, frustration, misunderstandings, was slowly transforming into something stronger. Respect, patience, understanding. The love between us hadn't disappeared, it had just been hidden under layers of stress and miscommunication. There were still small moments of tension, of course. Arguments didn't vanish completely. But now, instead of erupting into shouting matches, they became opportunities for conversation. "I feel upset when," replaced "you never," and "can we," replaced "why did you?" These small shifts in language made a world of difference. I started to see my husband in a new light. The anger I had feared was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. He had learned, perhaps reluctantly at first, that vulnerability isn't weakness. And my mom, too, had changed. She no longer feared speaking her mind, but she did so with a gentleness that respected our boundaries. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard them laughing in the living room. It was the kind of laughter that isn't loud or forced, but soft, heartfelt, and full of connection. I paused for a moment, listening, letting it sink in. That laughter wasn't just joy. It was proof of patience, proof of understanding, proof that even after a storm, warmth could return. I realized that day how fragile relationships can be, but also how resilient. One moment of anger doesn't define a family. One shouting match doesn't erase years of love and care. But the willingness to listen, to pause, to forgive, that can transform everything. And so slowly our home began to breathe again. The walls no longer echoed with frustration, but with understanding. My mom and my husband had found a rhythm, a space where they could coexist without fear or resentment. And I, standing in the middle, felt a quiet gratitude. Gratitude for the lesson, for the growth, for the healing that had started in those 5 minutes of tension. Looking back, I understand now that the moment I walked in and froze wasn't a disaster. It was the catalyst for change. It forced us all to confront our emotions, to step outside our comfort zones, and to embrace patience, understanding, and love. It showed me that even the most painful conflicts have the potential to bring people closer if we allow them to. That night, as I turned off the lights and went to bed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Our home had weathered a storm, and while the skies weren't completely clear yet, I knew that we were stronger for having gone through it. I realized that love isn't always quiet and easy. Sometimes it's messy, complicated, and even painful. but it's worth it every time. And in those quiet moments when the house was calm and the lights were dim, I knew something important. Change is possible. Anger can give way to understanding. Fear can give way to trust. And even when it feels impossible, moments of connection, small, heartfelt, and genuine, can transform everything. The days after that turning point were calmer, but I realized that calmness was fragile. It wasn't that the tension had completely disappeared. It was more like it had settled under the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And I knew that one wrong word, one misstep could stir it all again. I found myself paying closer attention to their interactions, noticing the small gestures that showed they were trying. My husband would ask my mom about her day, genuinely interested, and she would respond, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with hesitation. Those hesitations told me everything. That trust takes time, and even after a breakthrough, the road is still long. One evening, we had a minor disagreement about dinner. My mom had prepared something differently than my husband expected. Normally, this might have been the start of another shouting match, but this time he didn't explode. He sighed, ran a hand through his hair, and said softly, "It's not how I imagined it, but it's still good. Thank you." I couldn't help but smile. I could feel my chest relax. The tension in the room had dissipated before it even had a chance to build. My mom's shoulders lifted slightly, and she responded with a soft, "I'm glad you like it." I watched them, realizing how much growth had occurred in such a short period. It wasn't dramatic, not in the way movies show reconciliation. There were no grand speeches, no tears of apology. It was small, subtle, quiet, but that quiet was powerful. It was proof that patience, understanding, and the willingness to change can create a shift even in the most tense relationships. That night, as I washed the dishes alone, I thought about how much I had learned from simply observing. I had always believed that being a mediator meant speaking up, explaining, or resolving conflicts. But sometimes mediation is just about creating space for people to hear each other, space for emotions to settle, space for hearts to open. I remembered that moment when I first walked in and froze. I had thought I had failed by not intervening, but now I realized that standing back, letting them confront their emotions, and gently guiding them toward reflection had been the most important action I could take. It wasn't in words or forceful advice, it was in patience. The next morning, I noticed another change. My husband and my mom were sitting at the table, quietly drinking tea. He asked her about a recipe she had mentioned days ago. She smiled and shared the details. There was no judgment, no frustration, no irritation, just two people connecting slowly, learning each other again. I felt a wave of relief. It wasn't perfect yet, and I knew it wouldn't be, but the possibility of harmony felt real, tangible within our grasp, and that possibility filled me with hope that even after anger and misunderstanding, love could find its way back. Later that week, I suggested we all take a small walk together. The weather was mild, and the fresh air seemed to clear more than just the physical space. My mom hesitated, glancing at my husband nervously, but he smiled at her gently, nodding his head, and she agreed. As we walked, I noticed them talking quietly, leaning into conversation without fear or tension. My heart swelled as I realized something important. The healing process isn't immediate, it doesn't happen overnight. But every small step, every shared moment, every effort to understand, they add up. They matter. It was in those quiet, everyday moments that I realized our family was learning to navigate a new dynamic, one filled not with fear or anger, but with patience, respect, and an openness to change. A few days later, I noticed something subtle but significant. My husband, who had always been private about his feelings, began to open up, not in grand confessions, but in small, meaningful ways. One evening, while we were sitting in the living room, he spoke quietly to me, almost hesitantly. "I didn't realize how much I was holding in," he said, his eyes on the floor. "I didn't want to seem weak, but I think I was too hard on your mom." I nodded, my throat tight. "I think she understands now, and you've grown too. I can see it." He gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "I hope so." Later, I watched him help my mom carry some groceries. There was no tension, no hesitation, just a quiet willingness to share the effort, and my mom, in turn, seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It was a small act, but I realized that these small gestures were more powerful than any apology or lecture. That night, I lay in bed thinking about the fragility of relationships, how quickly anger can take over, and yet how slowly understanding can seep back in. I thought about my own role, how I had been silent when I first walked in, how I had paused and let them confront their emotions. I understood then that sometimes silence is stronger than words. Sometimes stepping back allows people to find their own way to each other. A few days later, an argument almost sparked again. It was over something trivial, a misplaced item, a misunderstood comment. My heart raced as I watched my husband start to raise his voice, but then he paused. He took a deep breath, looked at my mom, and said softly, "Let's just figure this out calmly, okay?" My mom nodded, her hands tightening slightly, but she didn't retreat. She responded carefully, and the conversation continued without anger. I realized then that this was progress. It wasn't perfection, but it was real. They had learned how to pause, to breathe, to think before reacting. That evening, after everything had calmed down, my husband turned to me and said quietly, "I never realized how much I could change, even in a small way." I smiled, my eyes misty. Change isn't instant, it's slow, but it matters. Over the next week, I noticed them laughing more often. My mom would tell a story about her childhood, and my husband would chuckle, sometimes teasing her gently. Their conversations, once filled with tension and frustration, were now filled with curiosity, patience, and care. One night, I overheard them discussing something as simple as a new recipe. They argued gently, not with anger, but with playful insistence. My mom insisted it should have more spices, my husband argued for less, and instead of shouting or withdrawing, they compromised. It was the first time I had seen compromise without tension, a true sign that understanding had taken root. I realized then that reconciliation isn't about erasing the past or pretending nothing happened. It's about learning from it, growing from it, and choosing to treat each other with respect and care, even when emotions run high. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought back to that moment I walked in and froze. It had been terrifying, but it had been the start of something new, something better, something stronger. It wasn't easy and it wasn't quick, but it was real. And I understood that life doesn't offer perfect solutions. It offers moments, small, fragile, and fleeting, where we can choose patience over anger, love over pride, and understanding over judgment. It's in those moments that relationships heal slowly but surely. The following week felt different. I could sense it in the way the house moved around me, quieter, gentler, lighter. My husband no longer approached my mom with caution bordering on fear. My mom no longer hesitated to speak her mind. There was still awareness of boundaries, of course, but it no longer felt like walking on a tightrope. One evening, we were all in the living room, the sun casting a soft, warm light through the windows. My mom had brought out some old family albums, and she started showing them to my husband. He leaned in, curious, genuinely listening. I watched them, my heart full. It struck me how small gestures, asking questions, sharing memories, listening, could rebuild trust faster than any forced conversation ever could. "You look just like your father in this photo," my husband said softly, pointing at an old picture of my mom's husband. She smiled, a bittersweet expression crossing her face. "Yes, he was very stubborn, just like you," she added with a faint laugh. I almost laughed out loud at that, the tension between them melting into humor. It was subtle, gentle, and yet powerful. For the first time, I felt that real connection had begun to take root. Later that evening, my husband and I sat together after my mom had gone to her room. He looked at me, tired but calm, and said, "I don't know how I let things get so heated. I've always tried to be patient, but I lost my way." I reached out, placing my hand over his. "We all have moments like that," I said softly. "What matters is what we do after. You're trying now, and that's enough." He nodded, exhaling slowly. I never want her to feel unwelcome. I want her to feel like part of the family." "You're doing that," I said, smiling, "every day in small ways." The next few days brought more of these small moments, my husband offering to help with chores without prompting, my mom sharing a new recipe and waiting for him to try it first, both of them laughing over small mistakes instead of getting frustrated. I realized that the real work of healing doesn't come from dramatic declarations or apologies. It comes from consistency, effort, and choosing kindness repeatedly. One night, as we sat quietly, I watched my mom carefully place her hand on my husband's shoulder while showing him an old photograph. He didn't pull away. Instead, he smiled softly, gently acknowledging her gesture. That small touch, unspoken but full of meaning, told me everything. It said, "We are learning, we are forgiving." Trying, it struck me then that sometimes love isn't loud. It isn't always about grand gestures or perfect resolutions. Often it's quiet, patient, persistent. It's the small acts that carry the most weight, the willingness to pause, to listen, to bend without breaking. And in that moment, I understood how far we had come. The anger, the yelling, the tension, they hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had lost their power. What had taken their place was something stronger, understanding, compassion. The knowledge that even when we stumble, we can get back up together. I realized something else too, that family is a living, breathing thing. It shifts, it grows, it struggles, and it heals. And we as its members must choose every day to nurture it, even when it's hard, even when patience feels impossible, even when past hurts linger. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a quiet sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The house, once heavy with tension, now felt alive with possibility. And I understood that the moment I walked in and froze, that terrifying, shocking moment, had been the turning point. It had shown me that even in the midst of anger, love can survive, patience can grow, and understanding can blossom. Sometimes it only takes a few minutes, just a pause, a breath, a willingness to try to change everything. And in those minutes, life feels lighter, hearts feel closer, and hope becomes real. The days following that shift in our home felt different. A kind of calm had settled in, but it wasn't the absence of tension that mattered. It was the presence of something new, something stronger, patience, understanding, the recognition that sometimes the hardest moments bring the deepest change. I started noticing the little things first. My husband would pause when my mom spoke, really listening instead of responding immediately. And my mom, for her part, seemed to take careful steps, adjusting how she expressed herself, aware of his boundaries without giving up her own voice. I realized that reconciliation isn't about erasing the past, it's about learning how to move forward together with awareness and care. One evening, I found myself in the kitchen while my mom prepared dinner. My husband was nearby, helping in small ways, setting the table, carrying ingredients. There was no tension, no sharp words. Only a quiet rhythm, like a soft song that had been there all along, waiting for us to notice. "You know," my husband said softly, glancing at my mom, "I think I've been too rigid. I wanted everything perfect, but life isn't perfect. And neither am I." My mom looked up from the chopping board, her eyes reflecting surprise and something softer, maybe relief. "We all make mistakes," she said, "even me." They exchanged a small, quiet smile. I felt a wave of warmth pass through me. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a scene from a movie. It was real, subtle, and fragile, the kind of moment that carries weight precisely because it's so ordinary. Over the next few days, I watched their relationship unfold in these tiny, almost imperceptible ways. My husband started asking for her opinion on household matters, really valuing it, and my mom, in turn, began to offer help in ways that felt cooperative rather than intrusive. They laughed together over small mistakes, burnt rice, a spilled cup of tea, and I realized these moments were healing the invisible scars that anger had left. I wanted to step in sometimes, to say how proud I was of them, but I knew this was their journey. My role wasn't to fix them, it was to witness the growth, to support it quietly, and to hold space for it. I had learned that trying to push too much could undo all the progress. Patience, I realized, isn't passive, it's active attention. It's observing, learning, and allowing people to grow at their own pace. One afternoon, we had a minor disagreement, something trivial about grocery shopping. Normally, it would have escalated quickly. But this time, my husband paused, took a breath, and calmly asked, "Can we talk about this?" My mom nodded, carefully explaining her perspective. There were moments of tension, small sparks, but they didn't ignite. Instead, they dissipated, replaced by conversation. I felt my chest loosen. It was strange, the relief of watching a potential conflict dissolve simply because two people had learned to pause, to listen, and to respect one another. I realized that this was the essence of reconciliation. It's not about perfection. It's about patience, respect, and the willingness to change even when it's hard. That night, as I lay in bed, I reflected on how far we had come. The house that once felt heavy with tension now carried a quiet warmth. Even in the moments of disagreement, there was a sense of safety, a recognition that anger no longer had the power to dominate, that patience and understanding had taken root. The most striking change I noticed wasn't in my husband or my mom individually, it was in the space between them. The room itself seemed lighter, conversations were gentler, laughter was softer, more genuine. And I realized that when two people work to understand each other, the energy of an entire household can shift. The next week brought more subtle transformations, and I began to see patterns in how they interacted, patterns I hadn't noticed before. My husband, who had once been quick to frustration, now seemed to measure his words more carefully. My mom, who had been cautious and tentative, now spoke with quiet confidence, offering opinions and sharing stories without fear of being judged or dismissed. One evening, I walked into the living room to find them sitting on the couch, looking through old family albums together. My mom was pointing to a photograph of herself as a child, and my husband lined in, genuinely curious. "What was your favorite memory?" he asked softly. She paused, then smiled, recalling a small story about her father. And he listened, not just listening, but engaging, asking thoughtful questions, commenting gently, laughing at the right moments. I watched them from the doorway, my heart swelling. It wasn't dramatic. There were no apologies or declarations, just two people connecting through shared stories, patience, and understanding. I realized then that healing doesn't always come in big moments. Often it comes in small ones, the quiet acknowledgement of someone's feelings, the willingness to let them speak, the choice to listen without judgment. These small acts were transforming their relationship more than any argument, apology, or explanation ever could. Later that week, a small conflict did arise, a disagreement over chores. Normally, this might have turned into a shouting match. But this time, my husband took a deep breath and said calmly, "I feel frustrated when things aren't done this way. Can we work together on this?" My mom responded in kind, explaining her perspective. There was tension, yes, but it didn't escalate. Instead, it became a conversation, a negotiation, a chance to understand each other. I realized then how much they had changed. Anger, while still present at times, no longer dominated. It had lost its power because understanding had taken its place. And watching them navigate these small conflicts, I felt a deep sense of hope. This was real growth, slow, imperfect, but genuine. One afternoon, I sat quietly in the kitchen while they were both outside in the garden. I could hear their laughter, see them moving together in harmony. My mom was showing my husband how to plant herbs, and he was listening, asking questions, sometimes making mistakes, and laughing when he did. It was a simple, ordinary moment, yet profoundly healing. I thought about how easily moments like these can be overlooked. It's tempting to focus only on the dramatic conflicts, the shouting, the tears. But the real work of healing, I realized, is done in these quiet, ordinary moments, in patience, in listening, in the effort to connect without expectation. That evening, as we all gathered for dinner, there was a new energy at the table. Conversation flowed naturally, with small jokes, gentle teasing, and laughter. My mom shared a story from her childhood, and my husband responded with a memory of his own. They listened to each other, responded thoughtfully, and the atmosphere felt warm, safe, and real. After dinner, I found myself reflecting on how far we had come. I thought back to the moment I had walked in and frozen, witnessing my husband's anger. At the time, it had felt like a disaster, but looking back now, I could see that moment as the catalyst for growth. It forced us to confront our emotions, to examine our behaviors, and to choose patience over pride, understanding over judgment. Later that night, I overheard my mom and my husband talking softly in the living room. They weren't arguing or raising their voices. They were discussing small plans for the next day, sharing opinions, laughing over minor details. It struck me then that reconciliation isn't about erasing conflict, it's about learning to navigate it together. And I realized something else: love isn't always loud. It doesn't need dramatic gestures or grand declarations. Sometimes love is in the quiet presence, in the willingness to pause, in the patience to listen, and in the courage to try again, even after mistakes. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a sense of peace settling over me, not because everything was perfect, but because everything had the potential to be better. The anger that had once seemed insurmountable had been softened by understanding. The tension that had once suffocated the house had been replaced with warmth, connection, and small, meaningful moments of shared humanity. And I knew that the journey wasn't over. There would be more disagreements, more misunderstandings, more moments of frustration. But now we had learned the tools to face them: patience, communication, and above all, a willingness to see the other person as human, flawed, and worthy of love. I realized that the moment I had walked in and frozen had been a turning point, but the real transformation was happening now, quietly in these days of gentle change, shared laughter, and patient understanding. The days that followed felt like a gentle unfolding, as if our home had learned to breathe again. I watched them carefully, noticing the subtle ways my husband and my mom had begun to adapt to each other. My husband no longer approached my mom with caution bordering on tension. My mom no longer hesitated to speak her mind. There was still care, respect, and awareness, but it no longer felt like walking on eggshells. One evening, I found them sitting together in the living room. My mom had pulled out a photo album from decades ago, and my husband was genuinely interested. "Who's this?" he asked softly, pointing at a photograph of my mom's younger brother. She smiled, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "That's my brother. He used to annoy me endlessly, but I loved him." They laughed together, not forced laughter, not polite smiles, but the kind of laughter that emerges when two people truly connect. I felt my chest tighten with gratitude. These small, quiet moments were the real markers of progress, more than apologies, more than conversations about the past. Later that night, my husband came to me, his eyes calm but thoughtful. "I don't know why it took me so long to understand. I've always tried to be patient, but I was too rigid. I wasn't listening." I reached out, placing my hand over his. "You're learning," I said softly, "and that's what matters. Every day you're learning." And he nodded, a small, almost shy smile crossing his lips. "I hope she feels welcome now," he murmured, referring to my mom. "You're showing her every day," I reassured him. Over the next few days, I witnessed more small gestures that marked the growing bond between them. My husband would help with tasks without hesitation, ask questions about her day, or check in before making a decision that affected both of them. My mom, in turn, shared stories, offered advice, and joined in family activities with openness and a gentle confidence. I realized that this transformation wasn't instant. It wasn't dramatic. There were no single moments that defined it. It was cumulative, built from small choices repeated over time, choosing patience instead of anger, choosing understanding instead of pride, choosing connection instead of withdrawal. One evening, I joined them in the garden. My mom was showing my husband how to plant herbs. He was fumbling at first, making mistakes, and she laughed gently, correcting him. "You're holding the spade wrong," she said, smiling. "I know," he replied, laughing too. "I'm trying. Don't be too harsh on me." They continued together, laughing, talking, and learning. And I realized then that what had seemed impossible, a tense household, arguments, misunderstandings, had begun to transform into something extraordinary. Connection, understanding, mutual respect, love. That night, as I watched them, I understood that family is not about perfection. It's about effort. It's about showing up over and over again, even when mistakes are made. It's about patience, forgiveness, and the willingness to try again. I thought back to that terrifying moment when I had walked in and frozen. At the time, it had felt like the worst possible thing: my husband yelling, my mom trembling, my own body frozen with fear and uncertainty. But looking back, I understood that moment as a catalyst. It forced us all to confront our emotions, to face the truth of our frustrations, and to begin learning how to heal. And healing isn't a single moment, it's not a dramatic resolution. It's a series of small, deliberate choices. Each gesture of patience, each act of listening, each moment of quiet understanding, together, they build something stronger than anger or resentment ever could. I realized then that we had crossed an invisible threshold. The anger that had once dominated the room no longer held sway. The tension that had suffocated our home had dissipated. What had replaced it wasn't perfect harmony, but it was better. It was a space where understanding and love could flourish, where mistakes could be forgiven, and where connection could grow. And in that quiet realization, I felt hope. Hope that no matter how dark or difficult a moment may feel, there is always a chance for change, a chance to listen, a chance to forgive, a chance to rebuild what seemed broken. That night, as the house grew still, I felt a profound sense of peace. Not because life was perfect, but because life was real, messy, challenging, and yet capable of transformation. and I knew that we had begun a new chapter, one defined not by anger, but by understanding, patience, and the quiet, enduring power of love. The changes in our home were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but over time they became impossible to ignore. I noticed how my husband would glance at my mom with a patient, gentle expression, even in small moments of frustration. My mom, in turn, began speaking up more confidently, but without the anxiety that had once accompanied her words. It was like a dance, careful, sometimes awkward, but growing more fluid with each step. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in the living room, watching them prepare a meal together. My husband was chopping vegetables while my mom stirred the sauce. They exchanged small jokes, laughed over minor mistakes, and occasionally paused to ask each other's opinions. There was no tension, no awkwardness, no fear. Just two people learning to coexist in a space that had once felt like a battlefield. I felt my chest tighten with gratitude. I had feared that our family dynamic might never recover, that the anger and frustration would linger indefinitely. But now I could see that change was happening quietly, steadily, in ways that were tangible even if not dramatic. Later that evening, I sat with them while they were putting the kitchen in order. My mom hummed softly as she wiped the counter, and my husband, for the first time, joined in, matching her rhythm without being prompted. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. It said, "I see you, I respect you, I am willing to adapt." I realized then that reconciliation doesn't always announce itself with a dramatic apology or a grand speech. Often it is hidden in these quiet acts, a pause before responding, a question asked sincerely, a shared laugh over something trivial. And in these moments, trust begins to rebuild brick by brick. The following days were filled with similar instances. My husband would ask my mom about her day before making a decision that affected the household. My mom, in turn, would share her thoughts openly, offering advice and assistance without hesitation. They were beginning to communicate as equals, not adversaries, not competitors, but as family members trying to navigate life together. One evening, I found myself reflecting on how far we had come. The house that had once felt heavy with tension now carried a gentle warmth. Conversations were slower, more thoughtful, and filled with a sense of care. Laughter was softer, genuine, and full of meaning. And I realized that this wasn't a temporary shift, it was a new way of being, a transformation that would take time to solidify but was now underway. Later that week, a small disagreement arose, a misplaced dish in the kitchen. Normally, this might have escalated into an argument, but this time my husband calmly asked, "Can we sort this out together?" My mom nodded, explaining her perspective without fear or frustration. They negotiated, compromised, and resolved the issue quietly. I watched, amazed at how far they had come. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't experienced in months. The anger that had once dominated our home no longer had power. Tension, once suffocating, had been replaced by connection, understanding, and a cautious but growing trust. I realized that the moment I walked in and froze, when my husband had been yelling and my mom had been terrified, had been the beginning of a long journey. It had forced all of us to confront emotions we often ignore, to face fears and insecurities, and to learn how to navigate them with patience and compassion. And now, months later, I could see the fruits of that journey in small, everyday interactions. My husband and my mom were still learning, still adjusting, but there was a rhythm to their relationship that hadn't existed before, a rhythm grounded in respect, understanding, and quiet love. The following week, I began noticing more subtle moments, the ones that truly mark change. My husband would pause in conversation, giving my mom the space to finish her thought before responding. My mom, who had once feared being judged or dismissed, now shared stories and opinions freely, confident that her voice was heard and respected. One afternoon, I walked into the living room to find them sitting side by side, quietly discussing an old family photo. My mom pointed to a picture of her childhood home and said softly, "This was where I first learned to bake bread with my grandmother." My husband leaned in, genuinely curious. What was that like? She smiled, her eyes glistening slightly. It was simple but happy. We didn't have much, but it felt like plenty. He nodded thoughtfully, and for a moment I felt the weight of the past lifting from the room. I realized then that these small exchanges, questions asked with curiosity, stories shared without judgment, were the real signs of healing. They were building a bridge, brick by brick, moment by moment. Later that evening, I overheard them in the kitchen discussing dinner plans. Normally, these conversations might have ended in frustration, minor arguments, or silent tension, but now they were filled with collaboration, gentle teasing, and laughter. My mom suggested a dish, and my husband responded with a small compromise. They worked together not as adversaries, but as partners. I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Watching them interact this way, I understood that patience and understanding are not passive. They require effort, intention, and a willingness to look beyond pride, fear, and past grievances. And the beauty of it is that these efforts, repeated consistently, begin to transform the entire atmosphere of a home. One night, as we gathered after dinner, I watched them share a story from their childhoods. My mom laughed softly as she recounted a mischievous incident involving her younger brother, and my husband joined in, recounting a similar memory from his own childhood. Their laughter intertwined, soft and genuine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was proof that the barriers between them, built from misunderstanding, frustration, and fear, were slowly dissolving. Yet, even in these moments of growth, I knew that old habits could resurface. One day, a small disagreement about cleaning schedules threatened to escalate. My heart raced as I braced for conflict, but instead of raising his voice, my husband calmly asked, "Can we talk this through?" My mom responded with patience and clarity, and the issue was resolved without tension. It struck me then how powerful change can be when people truly commit to it. It's not about perfection or eliminating all conflicts. It's about choosing compassion, patience, and understanding repeatedly, even in small, everyday moments. Over the next few days, I noticed my husband taking small steps to involve my mom in decisions that affected the household. He would ask for her input, genuinely consider her suggestions, and adjust his approach when needed. My mom, in turn, showed respect for his boundaries while still sharing her perspective, contributing to a new rhythm in our home. One afternoon, while I was cleaning, I overheard a quiet conversation between them. My mom was explaining a family recipe, and my husband listened intently, asking questions and laughing at small details. I paused, watching them interact. This was not about agreement or compromise, it was about connection, and it was unfolding naturally. It made me reflect on the first time I had walked in and frozen. That moment, which had once seemed terrifying, had been the start of a journey that neither of them fully understood at the time. It had forced us all to confront emotions we often avoid: anger, frustration, fear, and insecurity. And now, months later, those same emotions had been transformed into understanding, patience, and subtle, meaningful love. I realized then that family healing is rarely immediate. It's not a single dramatic moment, but the accumulation of small, intentional acts. Every gesture, every pause, every question asked with genuine curiosity contributes to change. And it is in these moments, repeated over time, that true transformation occurs. The following days felt lighter than I had ever remembered. I could sense a rhythm emerging in our home, a rhythm of patience, understanding, and quiet connection. My husband no longer approached my mom with apprehension, and my mom no longer hesitated to share her thoughts. There was awareness, yes, but it no longer carried the weight of fear or tension. One evening, I walked into the living room to find them sitting together with a cup of tea each. My mom was recounting a story about her childhood, and my husband listened intently, laughing gently at the right moments, nodding, asking small questions that showed he cared. Their interaction was effortless, natural, and yet, in its simplicity, profoundly healing. I realized then that reconciliation doesn't always happen in dramatic moments. It often happens quietly, almost imperceptibly, in gestures of attention, patience, and care. Every small act of listening, every moment of waiting before responding, every effort to understand without judgment, these acts build bridges stronger than any grand apology could. Later that night, I joined them in the kitchen. My husband was helping my mom prepare a small dessert. He had made mistakes, burnt the edges of the cake slightly, added too much sugar, and my mom laughed softly, correcting him gently. He smiled, admitting his errors without embarrassment. That moment, small and ordinary, was extraordinary in its meaning. It spoke of trust, patience, and mutual respect. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle but important shifts in the way they communicated. My husband would ask for her opinion before making decisions that affected both of them. My mom, in turn, would offer suggestions without fear of criticism. They were learning to negotiate, to listen, to compromise, and to respect each other's perspectives. And in this quiet learning, a deeper bond was forming. One afternoon, I sat quietly in the living room, watching them look through old family photographs together. My mom pointed to an old black and white picture and laughed softly. "I remember this day," she said, her eyes misty. "What happened?" my husband asked, genuinely curious. She smiled. "We tried to make a pie together. It was a disaster, but we laughed so much." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Sounds like us sometimes." I felt a wave of warmth sweep over me. That was it, the heart of change. Laughter, understanding, and the ability to embrace imperfections together. The anger and frustration that had once dominated our home had given way to connection, trust, and a growing sense of peace. That evening, I reflected on how far we had come. The moment I walked in and froze, terrified, unsure, and overwhelmed, had been the catalyst for a transformation I hadn't thought possible. It forced us to confront raw emotions, to face our vulnerabilities, and to learn patience and understanding in ways we never had before. I realized that family relationships are fragile yet resilient. They can fracture in moments of anger or misunderstanding, but they can also heal through small, deliberate acts of care and connection. True change isn't immediate, it's gradual, built through repeated choices to listen, to forgive, and to prioritize understanding over pride. One night, as I lay in bed, I overheard them laughing softly in the living room. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was genuine. My mom and my husband had found a rhythm, a shared space where conflict no longer ruled and understanding thrived. That moment, quiet and fleeting, was proof that even after anger and tension, reconciliation is possible. And I understood something important. Love doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always arrive in grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Often it is quiet, patient, persistent. It is in the small moments, a shared laugh, a thoughtful question, a gentle correction, a kind word, that it takes root and grows. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt a deep sense of peace. Our home, once tense and heavy with unspoken frustrations, now felt alive with possibility. And I knew that the moment I had walked in and frozen, a moment that had terrified me, had been the beginning of a journey toward understanding, patience, and love. The journey wasn't over, of course. There would still be disagreements, misunderstandings, and moments of frustration. But now we had the tools, patience, communication, and compassion to navigate them. And that knowledge, quiet and steadfast, filled me with hope for the future. The weeks that followed felt like a gentle unfolding, as though our home had learned to breathe again. There was a rhythm emerging, quiet, steady, and profoundly healing. My husband and my mom had moved past the initial tension, but now something deeper was developing: trust, real trust, not the fragile, cautious kind, but a trust born from repeated choices to listen, understand, and forgive. I watched them interact more closely than ever. One morning, my mom suggested we reorganize the pantry. My husband hesitated at first, but then he smiled and agreed. They worked together, laughing over small disagreements: should the jars go on the top shelf or the bottom, and then compromising without friction. I stood nearby, folding laundry, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't just the laughter or the cooperation, it was the attention to one another. The way my husband would pause when my mom spoke, waiting for her to finish her thought. The way my mom, once hesitant, now offered her opinions confidently but gently. These small, everyday choices were what truly mattered. They were building a relationship not on fear, pride, or obligation, but on mutual respect and understanding. One evening, I found them sitting together with a photo album of old family pictures. My mom pointed to an image of her wedding day. "I remember feeling so nervous," she said softly, a hint of a smile on her lips. My husband leaned in, genuinely interested. "What was it like?" She laughed quietly. "Chaotic. My sisters were arguing over flowers, and the photographer kept telling me to smile. But it was beautiful. It felt right somehow." He smiled in return. "I can imagine." I watched them, heart swelling. This simple exchange held more healing than any apology or lecture could have. They were connecting, truly connecting, across the divides that had once felt insurmountable. Later that night, I sat alone in my bedroom, reflecting. I thought back to the moment I had walked in and frozen, my husband yelling, my mom trembling, and me caught in the middle, unsure of what to do. At the time, it had felt like a disaster, but now I understood that moment differently. It had been a catalyst, a turning point, a reminder that raw emotions, when acknowledged and guided with patience, can create transformation. The next few days brought even more tangible progress. My husband began including my mom in decisions that affected the household, asking for her thoughts and genuinely listening. My mom, in turn, engaged openly, offering advice and assistance without hesitation. They were no longer tiptoeing around each other. They were partners in a shared space, navigating life together with empathy and respect. One afternoon, I found myself in the kitchen as they worked side by side preparing lunch. My husband had made a small mistake with a recipe, adding too much salt, and my mom laughed softly, correcting him gently. He laughed in return, admitting his error without embarrassment. Watching them, I realized that real connection isn't about avoiding mistakes, it's about responding to them with patience, understanding, and a willingness to grow together. That night, as we gathered for dinner, conversation flowed naturally. My mom recounted a story from her childhood, and my husband responded with a memory of his own. Laughter intertwined with curiosity. Questions were asked thoughtfully. Opinions were shared respectfully. The table, once tense and filled with apprehension, now felt alive with warmth, engagement, and love. I began to notice subtle, meaningful changes in myself as well. I no longer felt the same anxiety when they interacted. I didn't have to intervene, clarify, or mediate constantly. Instead, I could simply observe, grateful for the quiet progress, trusting that they were building a foundation of understanding and respect. It was as if the house itself had shifted. The walls no longer held echoes of anger, but the gentle rhythm of patience, laughter, and connection. There were still moments of tension, of course. A misplaced item, a miscommunication, or a minor disagreement would sometimes spark irritation. But now, instead of escalating, these moments became opportunities for dialogue. My husband and my mom had learned to pause, take a breath, and choose words carefully. And in doing so, they were slowly reshaping not just their relationship, but the energy of the entire household. One evening, my husband came to me, his voice soft. I never realized how much I was holding in before, he admitted. I thought I was being patient, but I wasn't really listening. I was focused on being right. I nodded, holding his gaze. You're learning, and that matters more than anything. Every day you're learning, he smiled faintly. I hope she knows I'm trying. You show her every day, I reassured him. In those moments, I realized that reconciliation isn't about grand gestures. It's about repeated, intentional acts, the pause before speaking, the genuine question asked, the willingness to adjust, the courage to apologize for small errors. Over time, these choices weave together into a tapestry stronger than any anger or resentment could tear apart. A few days later, I overheard them laughing in the living room. My mom had shared a story about her father, and my husband had responded with a memory of his own. Their laughter was soft, sincere, and full of shared understanding. I paused to listen, my heart swelling with gratitude. This was proof that transformation is possible, even after the most tense conflicts. I thought back to the moment I had walked in and frozen, a moment that had terrified me, and realized how far we had come. The anger that had once dominated our home had lost its power. The tension that had suffocated the house had been replaced with warmth, connection, and a deep, growing respect. I understood then that love isn't always loud or dramatic. Often, it is quiet, patient, and persistent. It is in the small acts, a shared laugh, a thoughtful gesture, a kind word, a pause before responding, that it takes root and flourishes. And in these acts, relationships heal. That night, as the house grew still, I felt a profound sense of hope. The journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges, misunderstandings, and moments of frustration. But we now had the tools to face them: patience, communication, empathy, and the courage to try again. And with these tools, I knew that our family could continue to grow stronger, closer, and more connected every day. The weeks that followed felt like a gentle transformation, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakably real. Our home, which had once felt like a battlefield of emotions, now carried a subtle warmth, a sense of calm that came from patience, understanding, and a shared willingness to change. I watched my husband and my mom with careful attention, noticing the small gestures that marked their progress. One afternoon, I found them sitting together in the garden. My mom was teaching my husband how to trim the plants, guiding his hands gently when he made mistakes. He laughed, a soft, open laughter I had rarely heard before, and admitted his errors without defensiveness. She smiled, nodding in approval, but without condescension. They moved together in a rhythm that felt natural, almost effortless. And I realized how much trust had grown between them. It struck me then that reconciliation is rarely about dramatic declarations or grand apologies. True reconciliation is quiet. It is built in the repetition of small, deliberate acts, listening, pausing, understanding, and showing care even when it isn't easy. Each act is a brick, each moment a layer in the foundation of a stronger, more resilient relationship. Later that evening, I sat quietly in the living room, watching them prepare dinner together. My husband offered suggestions, and my mom listened carefully, adjusting her approach when needed. They laughed over minor mistakes, a spilled cup, a burnt edge, and the laughter carried more meaning than any spoken apology could have. I realized that the tension we had lived with for months hadn't disappeared entirely. It lingered sometimes, like shadows in the corner of a room. But now it no longer had the power to dominate our interactions. Instead, it became a background presence, a reminder of how far we had come and a motivator to keep choosing patience, understanding, and empathy. One morning, I walked into the kitchen to find them quietly discussing a family recipe. My mom explained the steps, and my husband listened, nodding thoughtfully. He asked questions and offered suggestions, not to correct, but to understand. The way they communicated now was unrecognizable from the shouting and tension that had once filled our home. It was collaborative, respectful, and gentle, a partnership built on the lessons of patience and reflection. As I observed them, I reflected on the moment I had walked in and frozen. At the time, it had seemed like the worst possible scenario. My husband yelling, my mom trembling, and me caught in the middle, paralyzed, unsure of what to do. But that moment had forced all of us to confront raw, uncomfortable emotions. It had forced change, even if we didn't realize it at the time. Over the next few days, I noticed more subtle changes in their behavior. My husband began to include my mom in household decisions in ways he hadn't before, not as an obligation, but out of genuine care and respect. My mom, in turn, approached interactions with a new confidence, expressing her thoughts without fear or hesitation. Together, they were learning to navigate the complexities of family life with patience, empathy, and a shared commitment to understanding. One evening, as we gathered for dinner, the atmosphere felt lighter than it had in months. Conversations flowed naturally, filled with small jokes, thoughtful questions, and gentle laughter. My mom shared a story from her childhood, and my husband responded with a memory of his own, laughing softly. It was ordinary yet extraordinary, a sign that the barriers that had once divided them were slowly dissolving. Later that night, I overheard them talking quietly in the living room. My mom was recounting a memory from her past, and my husband listened intently, offering comments and asking questions with genuine interest. I paused to listen, feeling a sense of gratitude that I had not known before. This was proof that change, even after conflict, is possible when people are willing to try, to reflect, and to connect with honesty and patience. Over the following weeks, these quiet moments multiplied. Shared meals, collaborative chores, casual conversations, and small acts of kindness became the norm. The energy in the house shifted completely. Where there had once been fear and tension, there was now warmth and connection. Even when disagreements arose, they were addressed calmly, thoughtfully, and with consideration for one another's feelings. I began to notice changes in myself, too. I no longer felt the anxiety that had once gripped me when they interacted. I didn't feel the need to intervene constantly. Instead, I could step back and simply observe, grateful for the progress and trusting that they were building a foundation of understanding and respect. I realized that my role wasn't to fix them, but to witness, support, and allow their relationship to grow organically. One afternoon, I found them in the living room again, laughing over a memory from their past. My mom was telling a story about a holiday gone wrong, and my husband joined in, recounting a similar mishap from his own life. Their laughter intertwined, soft and genuine. I felt my chest swell with gratitude. These were the moments that mattered most, the quiet, ordinary moments where trust, connection, and love were nurtured. I thought back to the moment I had walked in and frozen. At the time, it had felt like the worst moment of my life. But now I saw it as the beginning of a journey that had brought growth, understanding, and a deeper connection than I had ever imagined possible. It had shown me that even in the midst of anger and fear, change is possible if people are willing to reflect, listen, and care. That night, as I lay in bed, I reflected on the lessons we had learned. Family relationships are fragile, but they are also resilient. They can fracture in moments of conflict, but they can also heal through repeated acts of care, patience, and understanding. True transformation doesn't happen overnight. It is built slowly, one choice at a time, through consistent effort and attention. I understood that the anger and tension that had once dominated our home had been transformed, replaced with warmth, connection, and a growing sense of trust. The journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges, moments of frustration, and misunderstandings. But we now had the tools to navigate them: patience, communication, empathy, and the willingness to try again. And in that realization, I felt a profound sense of hope. Our home, once heavy and tense, now carried lightness, warmth, and the promise of continued growth. I knew that love doesn't always arrive in grand gestures or dramatic resolutions. Often it arrives quietly, persistently, and patiently in shared laughter, small gestures, and the courage to understand one another. In that quiet, still night, I understood that we had begun a new chapter. A chapter defined not by anger, but by understanding, not by conflict, but by patience, not by fear, but by love. And in that understanding, I felt a deep and lasting sense of peace. The house was quiet that evening, but it felt different, not empty, not tense, but alive with a gentle warmth. I sat in the living room, watching my husband and my mom talking softly, sharing small jokes and quiet laughter. The tension that had once seemed permanent had lifted. It hadn't disappeared completely, but it no longer ruled our home. It had been replaced with something more enduring: understanding, patience, and care. I thought back to the moment I had walked in and frozen. My husband had been yelling, my mom trembling, and I had felt paralyzed, unsure of what to do. At the time, it had seemed like the worst possible moment of my life. I had felt fear, anger, confusion, and helplessness all at once. And yet, looking back now, I understood that moment differently. That moment had been the start of something profound. It had forced all of us to confront our emotions, reflect on our actions, and begin a journey of healing. Over the months, I had witnessed small miracles unfold. The quiet moments of connection, patience, and understanding had transformed our home. My husband had learned to pause, to listen, and to respond with care. My mom had grown confident in sharing her thoughts, trusting that she would be heard and respected. And through it all, I had learned the value of stepping back, observing, and allowing growth to happen organically. One afternoon, I joined them in the garden. They were planting flowers together, laughing quietly over a minor mishap with the soil. My husband made a small mistake, and my mom smiled, guiding him gently without criticism. He chuckled, admitting his error, and continued working alongside her. I paused, watching them, and felt a deep sense of peace. This was what family could be: imperfect, patient, connected, and full of love. I realized then that reconciliation doesn't always come in grand gestures or dramatic apologies. It comes in small, repeated choices: pausing before speaking, asking questions with genuine curiosity, listening without judgment, and showing care even when it is difficult. Each act, though seemingly ordinary, adds up to profound transformation. It builds trust. It builds understanding, it builds love. As the days passed, these moments multiplied. Meals were shared with laughter and conversation. Household tasks became opportunities for cooperation and connection. Misunderstandings, when they occurred, were handled calmly with dialogue and empathy. The rhythm of our home had changed, and with it, my own perspective had shifted. I no longer felt the constant anxiety that had once weighed on me. I could trust in the process, trust in my husband, trust in my mom, and trust in the strength of our family bond. Looking back, I understood something vital. Family relationships are fragile, but they are also resilient. They can break under the weight of anger, frustration, or misunderstanding, but they can also heal, often in ways that are quiet, patient, and persistent. True healing takes time, it requires repeated effort. It requires courage to be vulnerable, to forgive, and to keep trying even when mistakes are made. That evening, I sat quietly in the living room, reflecting on the journey we had taken. The anger, the yelling, the fear, it had all been transformed. What had replaced it was subtle, powerful, and enduring. The house felt lighter, conversations were gentler, laughter was more genuine, and hope, quiet, steady, resilient hope, filled the space. I realized that the moment I had walked in and frozen had been the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter that taught me that even when things seem at their worst, change is possible. That even after anger and fear, patience and understanding can take root. That love doesn't always arrive in dramatic gestures. Often it arrives quietly, persistently, and gently in small acts that add up over time. And in that realization, I felt a profound sense of peace. I understood that our journey wasn't about erasing the past or pretending that difficulties hadn't existed. It was about learning to navigate them, to grow from them, and to build something stronger on the other side. It was about creating a home filled with care, trust, and connection. As I looked at my husband and my mom, laughing softly together, I felt gratitude swell in my heart. Gratitude for patience, gratitude for understanding. Gratitude for the courage to try again even after mistakes. Gratitude for the simple, ordinary moments that had over time transformed our family. I knew that life would continue to have its challenges. There would still be disagreements, frustrations, and misunderstandings. But now we had the tools to face them: patience, empathy, communication, and the willingness to forgive and try again. And that knowledge filled me with hope that no matter how dark a moment may feel, there is always the possibility of change, understanding, and love. That night, as the house grew still, I reflected on what I had learned. Family is not perfect, relationships are not always easy, but the willingness to listen, to care, and to understand, even in the smallest moments, can transform everything. It can turn fear into trust, tension into laughter, and anger into love. And in that stillness, I felt a deep and enduring peace. I understood that the journey of our family, once fraught with conflict, had led us to a place of quiet strength. And I knew with certainty that as long as we continued to choose patience, understanding, and love, our bond would continue to grow stronger every day. Life had changed, our home had changed, and we had all changed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that everything, the struggle, the fear, the anger, had been worth it. Because on the other side of it all, there was love, quiet, patient, enduring love, and that, I realized, was everything.